Now let's talk about another country in the Asia Pacific region, and it's going to be a country that represents South Asia. And our next stop is India. The history of India, as we know it today as an independent country, began in 1947. Although the independence movement led by Mahatma Gandhi started at the beginning of the 20th century. So, why did India want independence in the first place? As those of you familiar with the history of colonialism might know, colonial rule almost always implied economic exploitation of the colonized country. India's wealth was drained to Britain, leading to widespread poverty and underdevelopment of the region. In addition, colonizers often implemented policies that discriminated the colonized. The British implemented the policies that discriminated Indians against Indians based on ethnicity and based on race. Indians were treated as inferior, leading to a strong desire for social and cultural freedom. As a result, we often see a rise of nationalism in colonized countries. And at that point, it takes a charismatic leader or a group of leaders that are able to mobilize the society to fight against the oppressors. And India got such a leader. His name was Mahatma Gandhi. Many nations pursued independence in the early to mid 20th century, but most of them did so through violence, through wars with the colonizers. Mahatma Gandhi's approach for the fight for independence in India was very distinctive because instead of riots and uprising, he advocated for passive, peaceful resistance and civil disobedience. One of the most famous examples of civil disobedience in India, led by Mahatma Gandhi, was the Salt March. It took place in 1930. During the British rule, the British government imposed a heavy tax on salt, which is an essential dietary supplement for most of us, as well as the Indian population. So Indians were prohibited from collecting or selling salt independently, and they were forced to buy it from the government that would in turn incur heavy taxes. Gandhi, along with a group of followers, decided to protest against this unjust tax and monopoly of the salt by the government. So he marched to the Arabian Sea to make his own salt. Gandhi, with a growing number of supporters who were joining him along the way, covered a distance of 240 miles, and it took them 24 days to reach a coastal village of Dundee. Upon reaching Dundee, Gandhi and his followers defied the laws by boiling seawater to produce salt. And despite that, India in the 1930s did not have free press, and the media were controlled by and censored by the British authorities. The news of the Salt March spread very rapidly throughout the word of mouth, and it captured the imagination of the Indian population. People just started making their own salt in violation of the British law, openly defying the authorities. This act of civil disobedience was symbolic, but it had a very significant impact. It inspired similar acts of civil disobedience across the entire country. The Salt March and the subsequent civil disobedience campaigns that followed the Salt March significantly contribute to mobilizing public opinion against the British rule in India. And it was a very powerful moment in the fight for independence. Thus, it can be actually said that India, more than any other country, won its independence through public relations campaigns rather than through wars and riots. Although, to be completely fair, there were some objective reasons why the British Empire had to grant independence to India peacefully. For one, right after the Second World War, Britain was economically and militarily weakened and it simply could not afford another war. Besides, India was essential to the Britain's economy, both a market for the British goods and a source of raw materials. So granting it independence peacefully could help maintain those economic ties with India through uh, trade agreements, even after the independence was granted. And to this day, the metropole, I mean the UK and the former colony, India, maintain pretty good relationships. And finally, which also can be considered a public relations issue, there was international pressure on the Great Britain. The global sentiment after the Second World War was against colonialism. Leaders of independent nations and international bodies like the United Nations were advocating for the end of colonial rule and the right of nations to self-determination. So it was simply not a good look for Britain at that time. The same year when India gained independence, it lost some of its territories, and those territories were mainly populated by Muslims, which wanted a separate state. And these territories we now know as Pakistan. And that partition was a bloodbath. The British administration that drew the partition plan lacked the basic knowledge of India, and it pretty much drew the borders with a ruler. And the provinces of Punjab and Bengal were effectively split in half, and millions of Indians and Pakistani Muslims found themselves in a wrong country. The 1947 partition of the Indian subcontinent into independent nations of Hindu, the majority of India, and Muslim majority Pakistan was accompanied by the largest mass migrations in human history and the violence on a scale that I don't think had been seen before. Here's how Ryan Perkins from the Stanford University described this. As the clock struck midnight on August 15, 1947, celebratory shouts of freedom from the colonial rule were drowned out by the cries of millions frantically making their way through the corpse-littered landscape of nascent India and Pakistan. After more than 100 years of British East India Company rule and an additional 90 years of the British Raj, the Indian subcontinent had finally achieved independence. What should have been a moment of crowning triumph after years of anti-colonial struggle was indelibly marred by unimaginable violence and bloodshed. Up to 2 million people lost their lives in the most horrific of manners. The darkened landscape bore silent witness to trains laden with the dead, decapitated bodies, limbs strewn along the sides of roads, and wanton rape and pillaging. There was nothing that could have prepared the approximately 14 million refugees for this nightmare. To this day, India and Pakistan have territorial disputes, and their mutual animosity was the primary reason for both countries to develop their own nuclear weapons. These uneasy relationships became a cornerstone defining both countries' foreign policy. So the history of modern India is both inspiring and very dramatic at the same time. Now, what does the country look like today? In terms of political profile, India is a multi-party democracy that is led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi as of 2023. He is a right-wing nationalistic conservative. The president role in India is mainly symbolic. It has a partly free status by the Freedom House, and that's because the elections generally are regarded as free as fair, but Muslim minorities, for example, face discriminations when it comes to procedures related to establishing citizenship. and that create obstacles for them in terms of political representation, that is electing officials and being elected. The reporters and opposition activists, NGOs, reporting on human rights abuse face threats and sometimes excessive use of force. There are tensions between Hindu nationalists and Muslim minorities. Some media outlets promote anti-Muslim views, and that's a practice that the Modi government have been accused of encouraging. In terms of media landscape, the media in India used to be pluralistic, but now it is dominated by populism and pro-government propaganda. Press freedom is guaranteed by constitution, yet attacks on press freedom have escalated dramatically under the Modi government. Reporting has become less critical and ambitious in recent years. Authorities have used security, defamation, sedition, and hate speech laws as a contempt out of court charges to quiet the critical voices in the media. And as of 2023, Reporters Without Borders ranked India 165th out of 180, or the 19th worst country in terms of press freedom. The last time I recorded this lecture, it was 131st place, so 20 position down. And this is really sad to see. Press ownership in India is concentrated in hands of a few conglomerates. Some are owned by PM Modi's friends. And until recently, the internet was relatively free of the government control, but now the government adopted an amendment to combat online disinformation, something that the Russian government has been doing all these years. And in effect, what it essentially does is requires social media such as Facebook, Twitter to take down any content which in the view of the government provides fake, false, or misleading information about any business of the central government. Sounds very, very familiar to me. The government suspends social media accounts of opposition leaders and can shut down the internet completely if there is a protest. In terms of corruption, India actually is not the worst country in the region. Its corruption levels are along the global averages, although Transparency International data suggests that India is more corrupt than, for example, China. And I would take this with a grain of salt, given the fact that Chinese citizens are reluctant to criticize their government due to the draconian restrictions on the freedom of speech. Unlike in China, people in India believe that it is the government officials, including the prime minister and the members of the parliament, as well as police, to be the most corrupt, while business executives and bankers are less so. Yet bribery and nepotism are quite common in day-to-day life. For example, 39 of respondents paid a bribe for basic public services such as healthcare and education in the last year. And 46% said that they used personal connections to get access to these services. 42% of those people who had contact with the police also had to pay a bribe. So not that inspiring. With all that being said, let's talk about India's economy and what makes India an attractive market for global corporations. India is the fifth largest world economy by GDP. Although India's GDP per capita is slightly over $2,000, which corresponds to a developing country category. So individually, on average, its citizens are not very rich, but because there's so many people, there are enough potential customers. Moreover, the population growth in China has been slowing down in recent years, whereas in India, it's been growing and it almost caught up with China. And as of 2021, they're both at 1.4 billion people in those countries. So this is a large consumer base, and this is a number one factor that makes India a very lucrative market. The second reason is its growing middle class. India's middle class is expanding very rapidly. As the incomes rise, consumer spending also increases. And that is especially true in sectors like technology, automobiles, healthcare, and entertainment. This growing middle class represents a pretty significant market for various goods and services. Another reason is the so-called demographic dividend. India has a pretty young population with a large percentage of people under the age of 35. And this demographic dividend means that it is going to be a large workforce, which is attractive for businesses that seek skilled and young talent. It also implies a significant market for products and services related to youth, as well as education and entertainment. Another reason why India is pretty attractive in terms of its economy is its digital transformation and its emerging startup ecosystem. India right now is experiencing a digital revolution. Its internet penetration is increasing, as well as the smartphone usage, online commerce, online services, digital entertainment, social media platforms have seen a very substantial growth because of that. International tech companies see India as a market with enormous potential for digital services specifically. In addition to that, India has a vibrant startup ecosystem with focus on technology, e-commerce, fintech, healthcare, as well as other sectors. Several Indian startups have gained global recognition. The country is becoming an attractive hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. Finally, infrastructure development. India has been investing in infrastructure projects, including transportation, energy, urban development. It has improved its infrastructure facilities, distribution, and the marketing of products and services, which makes it really a lot more easier for international corporations to operate in the country. The Indian government has been implementing some policy reforms to attract foreign investment, and that improves the ease of doing business in the country. These reforms create a more business-friendly environment for international corporations. Public relations as a profession in India began much earlier than in many other parts of the developing world. The first professional organization, PR Society of India, was formed as early as 1958 in Bombay. At the same time, the first course in public relations was also offered in Calcutta. So why so early? By the time India gained independence, multinational corporations, mostly British, had already been there. They were already existent or present. Suddenly, they found themselves in a position where they need to build and nurture relationships with new government leaders, new agencies, and they were quite different from their British predecessors. And this was happening not only at the national level, but also at the regional and local levels. And this all drove the need for people who could help with that. On top of this, the new parliament emerged. Now we've got elections, which also required people who would organize and run political campaigns. It's not to say that before the Indian independence there was no public relations in India. There was, but the British authorities and the British businesses practiced mainly one-way public relations, that is publicity and public information model, and the most practitioners were British. After the 1947, that began to change, and there was more need for locals in the industry, and the public relations began to evolve towards two-way, asymmetric, and symmetric models. According to Krishnamurthy Sri Ramesh, one of the most recognized Indian public relations scholars, India historically viewed public relations practitioners as fixers, those who could pretty much make things happen for the client, and generally by pretty questionable methods. Wining and dining were traditionally seen as part and parcel of effective public relations practice, and practitioners, more often than not, despite carrying the titles of managers, they actually performed technical tasks like writing press releases and organizing entertainment. Somewhere around the 1990s, the management began to recognize the value of public relations as an important management tool. And that's when we began to see a transition towards public relations being a management function and towards the symmetric model of public relations. One of the main challenges for international PR practitioners in India is its cultural diversity and large gaps between its urban and rural areas, as well as between the rich and the poor in various aspects of life. For example, English is one of the official languages there, and 10% of India's entire population speaks English, which, given the size of the country, makes it the second largest English-speaking country in the world after the United States. That was a very surprising fact for me personally. However, the percentage of English speakers drop as you move from urban to rural areas. Only 3% of people living in villages speak English. And this gap is even more pronounced if we look at income level. 41% of the rich Indians speak English compared to less than 2% of the poor. The differences in technological development between urban and rural states in India are also striking. For example, countrywide penetration rate sits at around 40% in India generally, yet in its most developed region, it's almost 70%. And in its least developed regions, it's only at 30%. Same goes for access to healthcare, education, literacy, and wealth distribution. All of this makes it challenging for practitioners to spread their messages. India's cultural diversity means that companies need to really tailor their products and marketing strategies to different regional tastes and preferences. Understanding and catering to this diversity can be a key factor in the success of international businesses in the Indian market. So audience segmentation is really key here. India's collectivism is another challenge for a Western practitioner. Many things in this society, as we've seen when we discussed corruption, are done through personal connections. So building interpersonal relationships with journalists, influencers, key opinion leaders would be really important. India is also a high power distance society, which has to do with the caste system, which was abolished fairly recently in 1950s. The Indian caste system was essentially a social hierarchy which categorized people into 5 distinct groups. Brahmins, the highest caste, were priests, scholars, and teachers, and they were responsible for religious rituals, teaching, and maintaining sacred knowledge. A bit lower in the social hierarchy were warriors and rulers, whose role was mainly to provide security and to protect the society. And then there were merchants, traders, and farmers, whose job was to produce and trade goods, contributing to the economic stability of the society. The next level was the laboring class, who served the higher castes and performed tasks that were less desirable by the members of those higher castes. And finally, untouchables. They were the lowest level of that social hierarchy. They were considered impure and often had the most degrading tasks, such as cleaning, scavenging, and handling dead animals. They actually faced severe social discrimination and were ostracized from mainstream society. The worst part of the social system was that these castes were hereditary, meaning that one belongs to a given caste because of his or her parents were in that caste. There was pretty much zero social mobility. And if you were born into a caste of untouchables, you will remain an untouchable till the rest of your life. And then your children will also be untouchable. Marriages between the members of different castes were considered a taboo. The Indian Constitution of 1950 outlawed untouchability and discrimination based on caste, and it allowed individuals to marry whoever they wanted, regardless of their caste or religion. Despite these legal changes and social efforts, intercaste marriages can still face resistance and also some societal pressure, especially in conservative communities or rural areas. The acceptance of intercaste marriages varies widely across different regions and communities. And while the situation has improved over the years, challenges still persist. Some scholars say that with the abolition of the caste system, social differences in India persist to this day, but now they are mainly based on wealth. So, display of social status is still an important thing in Indian society. So, in summary, despite some serious concerns about free speech and civil liberties, India is on track to become the next big spender in the global economy due to its successful economic initiatives and reforms, and just the sheer number of people that live there. This makes India a very attractive market for global corporations as well as potential investors. As PR practitioners, we need to pay attention to the huge regional differences in technological development, the distribution of consumers' purchasing power, or regional economic inequality. And we have to be very mindful and carefully navigate between the social and political interests of various ethnic and religious groups. So this was all about India, and this is it for today, and I'll see you next time.